Hey, I'm going to read from A Game of Thrones, Tyrion 2, and then I'm going to talk about it a little bit. He found a comfortable spot just beyond the noise of the camp, beside a swift-running stream with waters clear and cold as ice. A grotesquely ancient oak provided shelter from the biting wind. Tyrion curled up in his fur with his back against the trunk, took a sip of the wine, and began to read about the properties of dragonbone. Dragonbone is black because of its high iron content, the book told him. It is strong as steel, yet lighter and far more flexible, and of course utterly impervious to fire. Dragonbone bows are greatly prized by the Dothraki, and small wonder. An archer so armed can outrange any wooden bow. Tyrion had a morbid fascination with dragons. When he had first come to King's Landing for his sister's wedding to Robert Baratheon, he had made it a point to seek out the dragon skulls that had hung on the walls of Targaryen's throne room. King Robert had replaced them with banners and tapestries, but Tyrion had persisted until he found the skulls in the dank cellar where they had been stored. He had expected to find them impressive, perhaps even frightening. He had not thought to find them beautiful. Yet they were, as black as onyx, polished smooth, so the bones seemed to shimmer in the light of his torch. They liked the fire, he sensed. He'd thrust the torch into the mouth of one of the larger skulls, and made the shadows leap and dance on the wall behind him. The teeth were long, curving knives of black diamond. The flame of the torch was nothing to them. They had bathed in the heat of far greater fires. When he had moved away, Tyrion could have sworn that the beast's empty eye sockets had watched him go. There were 19 skulls. The oldest was more than 3,000 years old. The youngest a mere century and a half. The most recent were also the smallest, a matched pair no bigger than mastiff's skulls, and oddly misshapen. All that remained of the last two hatchlings born on Dragonstone. They were the last of the Targaryen dragons, perhaps the last dragons anywhere, and they had not lived very long. From there the skulls ranged upward in size to the three great monsters of song and story, the dragons that Aegon Targaryen and his sisters had unleashed on the seven kingdoms of old. The singers had given them the names of gods: Balerion, Meraxes, Vhagar. Tyrion had stood between their gaping jaws, wordless and awed. You could have ridden a horse down Vhagar's gullet, although you would not have ridden it out again. Meraxes was even bigger, and the greatest of them, Balerion the Black Dread, could have swallowed an aurochs whole, or even one of the hairy mammoths said to roam the cold wastes beyond the port of Ibn. Tyrion stood in that dank cellar for a long time, staring at Balerion's huge, empty-eyed skull until his torch burned low, trying to grasp the size of the living animal, to imagine how it must have looked when it spread its great black wings and swept across the skies, breathing fire. His own remote ancestor, King Loren of the Rock, had tried to stand against the fire when he joined with King Mern of the Reach to oppose the Targaryen conquest. That was close on 300 years ago, when the seven kingdoms were kingdoms, and not mere provinces of a greater realm. Between them, the two kings had 600 banners flying, 5,000 mounted knights, and 10 times as many free riders and men-at-arms. Aegon Dragonlord had perhaps a fifth that number, the chroniclers said, and most of those were conscripts from the ranks of the last king he had slain, their loyalties uncertain. The hosts met on the broad plains of the Reach, amidst golden fields of wheat ripe for harvest. When the two kings charged, the Targaryen army shivered and shattered and began to run. For a few moments, the chroniclers wrote, the conquest was at an end. But only for those few moments. before Aegon Targaryen and his sisters joined the battle. It was the only time that Vhagar, Meraxes, and Balerion were all unleashed at once. The singers called it the Field of Fire. Near 4,000 men had burned that day, among them King Myrna of the Reach. King Loren had escaped and lived long enough to surrender, pledge his fealty to the Targaryens, and beget a son, for which Tyrion was duly grateful. "Why do you read so much?" Tyrion looked up at the sound of the voice. Jon Snow was standing a few feet away, regarding him curiously. He closed the book on a finger and said, "Look at me and tell me what you see." The boy looked at him suspiciously. "Is this some kind of trick? I see you, Tyrion Lannister." Tyrion sighed. "You are remarkably polite for a bastard, Snow. What you see is a dwarf. You are what, 12? 14, the boy said. 14, and you're taller than I will ever be. My legs are short and twisted, and I walk with difficulty. I require a special saddle to keep from falling off my horse. A saddle of my own design, you may be interested to know. It was either that or ride a pony. My arms are strong enough, but again, too short. I will never make a swordsman. Had I been born a peasant, they might have left me out to die, or sold me to some slaver's grotesquerie. Alas, I was born a Lannister of Casterly Rock, and the grotesqueries are all the poorer. Things are expected of me. My father was the hand of the king for 20 years. My brother later killed that very same king, as it turns out. But life is full of these little ironies. My sister married the new king, and my repulsive nephew will be king after him. I must do my part for the honor of my house. Wouldn't you agree? Yet how? Well, my legs may be too small for my body, but my head is too large, although I prefer to think it is just large enough for my mind. I have a realistic grasp of my own strengths and weaknesses. My mind is my weapon. My brother has his sword, King Robert has his warhammer, and I have my mind. And a mind needs books as a sword needs a whetstone, if it is to keep its edge. Tyrion tapped the leather cover of the book. That's why I read so much, Jon Snow. The boy absorbed that all in silence. He had the Stark face, if not the name. Long, solemn, guarded. A face that gave nothing away. Whoever his mother had been, she had left little of herself in her son. "What are you reading about?" he asked. "Dragons," Tyrion told him. "What good is that? There are no more dragons," the boy said with the easy certainty of youth. "So they say," Tyrion replied. "Sad, isn't it? When I was your age, I used to dream of having a dragon of my own." "You did?" the boy said suspiciously. Perhaps he thought Tyrion was making fun of him. "Oh, yes. Even a stunted, twisted, ugly little boy can look down over the world when he's seated on a dragon's back." Tyrion pushed the bearskin aside and climbed to his feet. "I used to start fires in the bowels of Casterly Rock and stare at the flames for hours, pretending they were dragon fire. Sometimes I'd imagine my father burning, at other times my sister." Jon Snow was staring at him, a look equal parts horror and fascination. Tyrion guffawed. "Don't look at me that way, bastard. I know your secret. You've dreamt the same kind of dreams." "No," Jon Snow said, horrified. "I wouldn't—" "No? Never?" Tyrion raised an eyebrow. "Well, no doubt the Starks have been terribly good to you. I'm certain Lady Stark treats you as if you were one of her own. And your brother Robb, he's always been kind. And why not? He gets Winterfell, and you get the Wall. And your father, he must have good reasons for packing you off to the Night's Watch. "Stop it," Jon Snow said, his face dark with anger. "The Night's Watch is a noble calling." Tyrion laughed. "You're too smart to believe that. The Night's Watch is a midden heap for all the misfits of the realm. I've seen you looking at Yoren and his boys. Those are your new brothers, Jon Snow. How do you like them? Sullen peasants, debtors, poachers, rapers, thieves, and bastards like you all wind up on the wall, watching for grumpkins and snarks, and all the other monsters your wet nurse warned you about. The good part is there are no grumpkins or snarks, so it's scarcely dangerous work. The bad part is you freeze your balls off, but since you're not allowed to breed anyway, I don't suppose that matters." "Stop it!" the boy screamed. He took a step forward, his hands coiling into fists, close to tears. Suddenly, absurdly, Tyrion felt guilty. He took a step forward, intending to give the boy a reassuring pat on the shoulder or mutter some word of apology. He never saw the wolf, where it was or how it came at him. One moment he was walking toward snow, and the next he was flat on his back, on the hard rocky ground, the book spinning away from him as he fell, the breath going out of him at the sudden impact, his mouth full of dirt and blood and rotting leaves. As he tried to get up, his back spasmed painfully. He must have wrenched it in the fall. He ground his teeth in frustration, grabbed a root, and pulled himself back to a sitting position. "Help me," he said to the boy, reaching up a hand. And suddenly the wolf was between them. He did not growl. The damned thing never made a sound. He only looked at him with those bright red eyes, and showed him his teeth, and that was more than enough. Tyrion sagged back to the ground with a grunt. "Don't help me, then. I'll sit right here until you leave." Jon Snow stroked Ghost's thick white fur, smiling now. "Ask me nicely." Tyrion Lannister felt the anger coiling inside him, and crushed it out with a will. It was not the first time in his life he had been humiliated, and it would not be the last. Perhaps he even deserved this. "I should be very grateful for your kind assistance, Jon," he said mildly. "Down, Ghost," the boy said. The direwolf sat on his haunches. Those red eyes never left Tyrion. Jon came around behind him, slid his hands under his arms, and lifted him easily to his feet. Then he picked up the book and handed it back. "Why did he attack me?" Tyrion asked with a sidelong glance at the direwolf. He wiped blood and dirt from his mouth with the back of his hand. "Maybe he thought you were a grumpkin." Tyrion glanced at him sharply. Then he laughed, a raw snort of amusement that came bursting out through his nose, entirely without his permission. "Oh gods," he said, choking on his laughter and shaking his head. "I suppose I do rather look like a grumpkin. What does he do to snarks?" "You don't want to know." Jon picked up the wineskin and handed it to Tyrion. Tyrion pulled out the stopper, tilted his head, and squeezed a long stream into his mouth. The wine was cool fire as it trickled down his throat and warmed his belly. He held out the skin to Jon Snow. "Want some?" The boy took the skin and tried a cautious swallow. "It's true, isn't it?" he said when he was done. "What you said about the Night's Watch." Tyrion nodded. Jon Snow set his mouth in a grim line. "If that's what it is, that's what it is." Tyrion grinned at him. "That's good, bastard. Most men would rather deny a hard truth than face it." "Most men," the boy said, "but not you." "No," Tyrion admitted. "Not me. I seldom even dream of dragons anymore." "There are no dragons." He scooped up the fallen bearskin. "Come, we had better return to camp before your uncle calls the banners." The walk was short, but the ground was rough underfoot, and his legs were cramping badly by the time they got back. Jon Snow offered a hand to help him over a thick tangle of roots, but Tyrion shook him off. He would make his own way, as he had all his life. Still, the camp was a welcome sight. The shelters had been thrown up against the tumble-down wall of a long-abandoned holdfast, a shield against the wind. The horses had been fed and a fire had been laid. Yoren sat on a stone, skinning a squirrel. The savory smell of stew filled Tyrion's nostrils. He dragged himself over to where his man Morek was tending the stew pot. Wordlessly, Morek handed him the ladle. Tyrion tasted and handed it back. "More pepper," he said. Benjen Stark emerged from the shelter he shared with his nephew. "There you are. Jon, damn it. Don't go off like that by yourself. I thought the others had gotten you." "It was the Grunkins," Tyrion told him, laughing. Jon Snow smiled. Stark shot a baffled look at Yoren. The old man grunted, shrugged, and went back to his bloody work. The squirrel gave some body to the stew, and they ate it with black bread and hard cheese that night, around their fire. Tyrion shared around his skin of wine until even Yoren grew mellow. One by one, the company drifted off to their shelters and to sleep, all but Jon Snow, who had drawn the night's first watch. Tyrion was the last to retire, as always. As he stepped into the shelter his men had built for him, he paused and looked back at Jon Snow. The boy stood near the fire, his face still and hard, looking deep into the flames. Tyrion Lannister smiled sadly and went to bed. That was the majority of the chapter, A Game of Thrones Tyrion 2. I'll take it from the top. Tyrion goes off to read alone in the woods, and he's reading a book about dragons. It says Tyrion had a morbid fascination with dragons. And Tyrion's fascination with dragons comes up many times throughout this chapter. In many different ways, actually. He remembers the time he saw the dragon skulls under the Red Keep. And he remembers being awed by them. He remembers the histories of Aegon the Conqueror, and the Field of Fire was the only time that Vhagar, Meraxes, and Balerion were all unleashed at once, to win a battle that would have otherwise been hopeless for the Targaryen side. He says he used to dream of having a dragon of his own when he was Jon's age. He used to start fires in the bowels of Casterly Rock and stare at the flames for hours, pretending they were dragon fire. And imagines what he would do if he had dragon fire at his disposal. He would burn his father, Tyrion Lannister, or his sister, Cersei Lannister, or both. Tyrion says, "Oh yes, even a stunted, twisted, ugly little boy can look down over the world when he's seated on a dragon's back." This line tells me as clear as anything that, to Tyrion, a dragon is a place from which to look down over the world. It's an ultimate way to correct for an inequality that he inherited at birth, his dwarfism. And he's plenty conscious that that is the reason that dragons appeal to him, because he calls himself a stunted, twisted, ugly little boy in the same line. It also comes through in the identities of the people he wants to burn, who are his family. Because Tyrion was mistreated by Tywin and Cersei for his whole life, and he's made the connection that if he wasn't born a dwarf, he probably wouldn't have been mistreated. And even if he would have, certainly not as badly as he was, to judge by stories we get about Tyrion's childhood, such as this line on the next page where it says, "It was not the first time in his life he had been humiliated, and it would not be the last." So Tyrion is a cynical character, but he's also a very down-to-earth character, and the line between those two things is not always so clear. The blurriness of that line is, I think, the main subject of this chapter. I call it a Song of Ice and Fire's theme about nihilism versus hard truth. It's so pervasive throughout the story that it's usually the first thing people describe about the story when they're telling somebody who hasn't read or watched it what kind of story it is. They'll say things like, it's a story where anybody can die. The heroes are not safe. They don't have plot armor. More vaguely, they'll say the story is subversive. And that first description falls into that category. Sometimes people will say that this is a story that breaks tropes, and that George R. R. Martin is a trope breaker, which is more false than true, but not without some truth. George R. R. Martin adheres to the tropes that he uses. He just adheres to them in a way that an audience like us is not likely to expect. As Jon and Tyrion begin talking, Tyrion teaches Jon a really profound and important lesson. It's about making the most of what you have. Tyrion says he doesn't have the physical characteristics to be what most men want to be in this setting. They want to be a warrior or a leader. He needs a special saddle to ride a horse. His limbs are too short to be a great swordsman. But thankfully he was born into a very rich and powerful house, House Lannister. But that comes with responsibilities. He says things are expected of me. So he wants to find some way to contribute to his family and house, and their legacy and future. At least part of him does. Apparently another part of him wants to burn his family alive. And it's safe to say those two parts of Tyrion are in conflict with each other, because together they don't make sense. And the summary of his lesson to Jon is, I have a realistic grasp of my own strengths and weaknesses. My mind is my weapon. My brother has his sword, King Robert has his war hammer, and I have my mind. And a mind needs books as a sword needs a whetstone, if it is to keep its edge. That's why I read so much, Jon Snow. So Tyrion's saying that books sharpen your mind, giving you an intellectual edge in whatever goal you're pursuing. Whether that's war, politics, economics, relationships, dragons, whatever. Making your own saddle. And then Tyrion says he used to dream of having a dragon. That he can look down over the world when he's seated on a dragon's back. And he confesses rather casually to wanting to burn his father and sister alive. And Jon just stares at him in horror and fascination. The source of Jon's horror being obvious, and the source of Jon's fascination apparently being that Tyrion would so casually confess to having thoughts so evil. So unambiguously evil. And Tyrion says, don't look at me that way, bastard. I know your secret. You've dreamt the same kind of dreams. And so Tyrion, throughout all of Tyrion's chapters in the series, there's a trend of Tyrion assuming the worst in people. Where, whatever the situation is, he'll tend to assume the worst intentions or actions on the part of the other person, even if that person is not necessarily an adversary to Tyrion. And it gets him into trouble once in a while. But I can understand why a person with his condition would have that tendency. It doesn't make it right or a good idea, but understandable is enough for our purposes of understanding Tyrion. Jon says, no, I wouldn't, and he trails off. And Tyrion's doubtful. He says, no, never. He raises an eyebrow. And then Tyrion lists a bunch of reasons why Jon not having the same kind of dreams about burning his family members or harming them is believable. But the subtext of the list is that these are actually reasons why it's not believable. He says, well, no doubt the Starks have been terribly good to you. I'm certain Lady Stark treats you as if you were one of her own. Subtext, I'm certain Lady Stark does not treat you as if you were one of her own. He says, and your brother Robb, he's always been kind, and why not? He gets Winterfell and you get the Wall. Subtext, your brother Robb has always been kind, and why not? He gets a good deal and you get the shit deal. He says, and your father, he must have good reasons for packing you off to the Night's Watch. The subtext being not even your father wants you around anymore because now that you're coming into adulthood, you're going to be a political problem to his family, being a bastard. "Stop it," Jon Snow said, his face dark with anger. "The Night's Watch is a noble calling." And Tyrion laughs and he continues, unwisely. He says, "You're too smart to believe that. The Night's Watch is a midden heap for all the misfits of the realm. I've seen you looking at Yoren and his boys. Those are your new brothers, Jon Snow. How do you like them? Sullen peasants, debtors, poachers, rapers, thieves, and bastards like you, all wind up on the wall, watching for grumpkins and snarks and all the other monsters your wet nurse warned you about. The good part is there are no grumpkins or snarks, so it's scarcely dangerous work. The bad part is you freeze your balls off, but since you're not allowed to breed anyway, I don't suppose that matters." Holy crap, what a savage, right? So Tyrion he's implying that Jon is stupid, first of all. He says, you're too smart to believe that. Or delusional at best. He's deluding himself that the Night's Watch is a noble calling. Essentially, Tyrion's attacking Jon's purpose for joining the Night's Watch. And his prospect for a meaningful future in life. So it's a really nasty thing to attack on Tyrion's part. Especially considering Jon is a teenage boy, and Tyrion's in his 20s. His late 20s, I think. If they were both teenage boys, it would just be like... There would be an element of, yeah, this is just what teenage boys do to each other. They're kind of assholes to each other because they're unrefined. They're still maturing. But that isn't the case here. Tyrion's very much the elder to Jon Snow, who should be encouraging teenage boys to go out into the world and make their place in it. Especially bastards, who have an especially hard time doing that, given that they don't get to inherit the castle, or get married into another castle, or even get to inherit a holdfast or keep somewhere. And that there is a stigma against bastards, where everybody in Westeros tends to believe that bastards are treacherous by nature. They're just born that way, with an inherent evilness that compels them to steal the inheritances of their trueborn siblings. If ever there's an opportunity to do that. Which is why Catelyn Stark is so bothered that Jon gets to stay in the castle of Winterfell beside her trueborn children. Because there's no better way to encourage a bastard's treachery than to keep him in a position where he can do that treachery. I don't want to go too far into the topic of Catelyn, because that's a bottomless pit of discussion. But the point is that even if what Tyrion's saying has some truth to it, he's delivering that truth in a way that the person he's delivering it to is unlikely to accept or be able to tolerate. And he's purposely doing it that way. Which you might also call cynicism, which you might also call nihilism, because when you take cynicism to its ultimate conclusion, it's just nihilism. So the hard truth of the Night's Watch is that it is a, quote, midden heap for all the misfits of the realm. Sort of. Jon probably imagined the men of the Night's Watch would all be like his Uncle Benjen, a very capable and respected castle-born and raised man. But as he's traveling with this group to the wall, he can see the first hints that that's not really the case. And Tyrion wastes no time rubbing it in Jon's face. He says, "I've seen you looking at Yoren and his boys. Those are your new brothers, Jon Snow. How do you like them? Sullen peasants, debtors, poachers, rapers, thieves, and bastards like you, all wind up on the wall." But then he goes further. He says, "Watching for grumpkins and snarks and all the other monsters your wet nurse warned you about. So not only is the order you're committing your entire life to going to place you in the company of dishonorable criminals and cowards of all kinds, but your purpose there, like the purpose of the rest of them, is going to be completely meaningless, because the monsters that you're protecting the realm from don't actually exist." Which is the implication when you call them grumpkins and snarks. And to top it all off, he says the bad part is you freeze your balls off. So it's going to be terribly cold and uncomfortable. And all the problems that go along with that, like a scarcity of food and a variety of food. And entertainment, because what kind of singer wants to come to a place so miserable? So in just 2 paragraphs, Tyrion has deployed the most crushing and complete criticism of Jon, his past, his present, and his future that anybody could ever formulate. So it's no wonder Jon gets so mad about it. He screams, "Stop it!" His direwolf mirrors that anger and knocks Tyrion down. And it says, suddenly, absurdly, Tyrion felt guilty. So why do you think Tyrion felt guilty? I mean, if what Tyrion's doing is nothing more than delivering a hard truth, then he shouldn't have any reason to feel guilty. Should he? Hard truth is still truth. It's even pretty rare, because most people don't want to tell you hard truths, because they're hard. I think Tyrion feels guilty because he knows that what he's doing is, it goes beyond trying to help Jon. He's corrupting the truth by delivering it in a way and at a time, in the way that there's minimal chance that the person he's delivering it to is going to be able to accept it and tolerate it. And it's also partly just flat out wrong. Jon's line, "The Night's Watch is a noble calling," is still true. And part of Tyrion's point is that it's a meaningless, if not ignoble, calling. And both of those are actually wrong. Tyrion doesn't know that the meaningless part is wrong, but he does know that the ignoble part is wrong. Because even if the threats beyond the wall are all made up, the intention to protect the realm against them is still noble. It's just misplaced, and maybe foolish because of it, but still noble. And even then it wouldn't be entirely without nobility, to the extent that it's giving these men a purpose and a place in the world to belong and do something, rather than just be executed. They're maintaining a wall and a castle, which is approximately the same thing that Bran and Rickon would have done if Robb hadn't died. Or that Jon would have done if Jon was a trueborn son. They would have inherited castles or keeps in the north, and or through marriage, and just tended to those castles and keeps and lands, the same way that the Night's Watch tend to the wall, and the castles on it and the surrounding lands. Oh, I missed one. Tyrion says, "But since you're not allowed to breed anyway, I don't suppose that matters," in reference to freezing his balls off. So it's a reminder that you're going to be alone. You're never going to get to have a wife or kids and be surrounded by other men your whole life. So it really is the most crushing and complete assault on Jon's future, his prospective future. And after Ghost knocks Tyrion down, Ghost kind of stands over him and doesn't let him back up. And Jon Snow pets Ghost and smiles. And he says, "Ask me nicely." So Jon is enjoying this moment, this sort of revenge against Tyrion, where he's got power over Tyrion to harm him. And he's sort of dangling that power over him through his direwolf. Now, you could put all the blame on the direwolf, but if you watched my direwolf episode, I said that the direwolves represent the Stark's subconsciouses, because the direwolves are constantly acting out the Stark's subconsciouses, specifically that of their master, and Jon is Ghost's master. And the same thing's happening here, where there can be little doubt that Jon's feelings about what he wants to do to Tyrion are basically the same as what Ghost is doing to Tyrion. He wants to hurt him, and if his conscience won't let himself hurt him, he'll settle for exerting power over him, and proving that he's the powerful one in the situation, to patch up his ego that Tyrion just badly bruised. After Jon's exerted his physical dominance over Tyrion through Ghost, Tyrion's scared enough of the direwolf to actually ask Jon to call the direwolf off. Tyrion's angry, but he crushes it out. He says, "I should be very grateful for your kind assistance, Jon," he said mildly. "Down, Ghost," the boy said. "Why did he attack me? Maybe he thought you were a Grumpkin." They both laughed. "I suppose I do rather look like a Grumpkin. What does he do to Snarks? You don't want to know." So quick as that, they've made up and they're on good terms again. So there's a recognition within both of them, I think, that Tyrion went too far, but he didn't do it because he wanted to hurt Jon. It was almost involuntary in Tyrion, but he realized after the fact that it was wrong. And he felt bad about it. That suggests that in some amount, Tyrion didn't hurt Jon on purpose. Or at least, even though there obviously is a part of Tyrion that wanted to hurt Jon, there's a part of him that doesn't. And those two parts are in conflict. And then Jon and Ghost knocking him to the ground woke Tyrion out of the one impulse and back into the other. And I think that's the reason Tyrion's able to laugh at the end of this too. Make fun of himself a little bit. Where there's a recognition in Tyrion that, yeah, I did go too far. And I didn't mean to. Well, part of me meant to, but the other part of me didn't mean to. And sorry. And I obviously got problems, and I'm working on them. I think the same sort of thing is going on in Jon, where he realizes that he overstepped a little bit. He shouldn't have dangled the sword over Tyrion's throat in the form of Ghost's jaws. On the condition that Tyrion say what Jon wants him to say and the way he wants him to say it. He says, "Ask me nicely." Because afterwards Jon says, "It's true, isn't it? What you said about the Night's Watch." So Jon recognizes that even though Tyrion delivered the hard truth wrong, it's still hard truth. And he's not going to use the wrongness of the delivery as an excuse to invalidate the truthfulness of the hard truth. Because you can imagine the temptation to do that would be pretty strong. Like, who the hell wants to face a hard truth? That's why it's called hard truth. If you can just tell yourself the person who told it to you is an asshole and move on and ignore it, usually that's what people will do. Especially if that person is actually an asshole, like Tyrion. Or half an asshole, however you want to split it. And Tyrion says, "I seldom even dream of dragons anymore. There are no dragons." So despite Tyrion's obsession with dragons and his childhood dream of riding a dragon of his own, he acknowledges here at the end of their conversation the validity of something Jon said. There are no dragons. And in doing so, he puts himself in the same position as Jon, where his hopes and dreams of transcending the undesirable situation that he inherited at birth, for Jon is bastardy, for Tyrion is dwarfism, are dead. They're crushed. Or at least they're withered and dying. The two men are on their way back to camp, and it says, Jon Snow offered a hand to help him over a thick tangle of roots, but Tyrion shook him off. He would make his own way, as he had all his life. And then when they get to the camp, we can see that someone else put Tyrion's tent up for him, is cooking stew for him, and he's telling them, add more pepper to it. And so one question you could ask yourself is that if you had to be one or the other, who would you rather be? Jon or Tyrion? Or another way of asking it is, if you had to live in this world and inherit one of their conditions of birth, bastardy or dwarfism, which one would you rather inherit? And try to keep in mind how strong the stigmas are against bastardy, where basically everyone you meet is going to think there's something morally deficient about you before you've said or done anything. And actually that the same thing is true about dwarves. I think dwarves are devious. It says, Tyrion was the last to retire, as always. As he stepped into the shelter his men had built for him, he paused and looked back at Jon Snow. The boy stood near the fire, his face still and hard, looking deep into the flames. Tyrion Lannister smiled sadly and went to bed. I love the ending of that chapter. I think Jon is meditating on the things he learned from Tyrion and his lot in life, and he's trying to come to terms with it. And Tyrion's looking back at Jon, and he smiles sadly, which is, well, it's an interesting kind of smile. I think Tyrion sees some of himself in Jon, where they're both in this position of outcast, social outcast. And they're frustratingly on the edge of social acceptance, where Jon is actually a castle-raised son of the Lord. He was just conceived out of wedlock. And that's the only reason that this is his lot in life. Some technicality that happened before he was ever born. And with Tyrion, it's very similar. It's he was just born a dwarf. Just a matter of genetic chance, basically. It's out of anybody's control. And I think part of the explanation of Tyrion's sadness is that it's his guilt. It's the guilt he felt earlier of what he did to Jon was wrong. But he can't control his impulse to do it. We'll all probably recognize the term misery loves company. I think that's what's going on with Tyrion. He wants to make people as nihilistic as he is. And so, whenever there's an opportunity to do that, and to disguise it, in this case, disguised in hard truth, he's going to do that. And he does the same thing when he's giving advice to Aegon in A Dance with Dragons. And he does it constantly throughout the series, everywhere in between. One thing I noticed about Tyrion is that he wants to hurt his family and get back at them. He dreams about burning his father and sister alive. He suggests at breakfast at Winterfell that he does not love his family, with the comment to Jaime, "You know how much I love my family." Yet despite all of that, Tyrion still does everything in his power to help his family and prove himself to his family. He still wants them to love him. He actually has not given up on earning his father and his sister's love. He already has his brother's love, but he wants his father's love, most of all, I think. But unlike with Cersei in the show, I don't think Tyrion can ever earn the love of Cersei in the books. But Tywin's a different case. I think Tywin is capable of authentic love, but I don't think that Tyrion could ever earn it. Because I think Tywin's love would be self-serving, even if he did give it to Tyrion. He would always dangle it over Tyrion and threaten to withdraw it, or withhold it. To keep Tyrion usefully chasing the carrot on the stick, basically. Or I think Tywin would just take advantage of Tyrion's talents, implying that if Tyrion does this next thing that Tywin wants him to do, and does it well and perfectly, that he'll earn a place in Tywin's heart. But even if Tyrion were to do it perfectly, Tywin would find fault with it anyway, specifically so that he doesn't have to surrender any of his love to Tyrion. At least nothing more than a sideways compliment, like, "Well, you probably didn't do as bad a job as Moon Boy would have." Or just crap like that. A Song of Ice and Fire is a story that loves to play with the duality of interpretation of dragons. The trope in fantasy is that you divide the world between East and West. And the reason that trope exists is because that's the way the real world is divided. And the difference between reality and fiction is that fiction has to be credible. Reality is real whether you believe it or not. And with such a huge divide between two land masses, there emerges two different cultures. The Eastern tradition is the older of the two. In the East, dragons are seen as lucky and majestic and rare and eternal. There, dragons can still die, but they're never dead forever, and they always come back. Sometimes they grant wishes, like the dragon in the Dragon Ball series. They're usually more snake-like in form. They don't always have wings, but they can almost always fly. And they bring good luck, which is maybe one of the strangest parts of the Eastern tradition, coming from the Western tradition. In the Western tradition, dragons are terrible evil monsters to be slain and harvested. In the Eastern tradition, they dream of one day riding a dragon, and in the West, they dream of slaying one. And this duality comes up all throughout the series, where to Daenerys, her dragons are special and lucky and majestic and beautiful, and to her Dothraki people, they're ugly and monstrous and evil and terrible beasts that brave men kill. Brave, strong men kill them. I think one of the handmaidens says that. And the duality even comes up right here in this chapter with Tyrion, where Tyrion remembers the histories of Aegon the Conqueror and his two sister wives at the Battle of the Field of Fire. It says, "The hosts met on the broad plains of the Reach, amidst golden fields and wheat ripe for harvest. When the two kings charged, the Targaryen army shivered and shattered and began to run. For a few moments, the chroniclers wrote, the conquest was at an end. But only for those few moments, before Aegon Targaryen and his sisters joined the battle. It was the only time that Vhagar, Meraxes, and Balerion were all unleashed at once. The singers called it the Field of Fire. Near 4,000 men had burned that day, among them King Mern of the Reach. King Loren had escaped and lived long enough to surrender, pledge his fealty to the Targaryens, and beget a son, for which Tyrion was duly grateful." This history of the Field of Fire depicts the Targaryen side as the underdog. The Targaryens were outnumbered, so it depicts the Targaryens as the underdogs. And then it says, when the two kings charged, the Targaryen army shivered and shattered and began to run. For a few moments, the chroniclers wrote, the conquest was at an end, ... But only for those few moments, before Aegon Targaryen and his sisters joined the battle. So Aegon Targaryen and his sisters and their dragons are depicted as the heroes of the battle. Their side is the underdog, and they fly in on their dragons to win a fight that looked all but lost, and turn the tides of battle so severely that the other side, even though they have 5 times the numbers, were just completely obliterated. So badly that the battle earned the name the Field of Fire. They set 4,000 men on fire that day. Among them, King Mern of the Reach. King Loren had escaped, and lived long enough to surrender, pledge his fealty to the Targaryens, and beget a son, for which Tyrion was duly grateful. And the reason Tyrion is grateful is because that's Tyrion's ancestor. If that ancestor had been killed by Aegon Targaryen, instead of surrendering and pledging his fealty, Tyrion wouldn't exist. In the most general sense, Tyrion's role in this story appears to be that he's a misunderstood good guy. He's cynical, but ultimately he's a good person. He's sympathetic toward cripples, bastards, and broken things. He can be a jerk sometimes, but he can also be really nice and generous. Like the time he shared his saddle design with Bran, so that Bran could ride a horse. But if you put yourself in the shoes of the near 4,000 men who burned that day on the field of fire, there can be no question that from their point of view, Aegon Targaryen and his sisters and their dragons were not the heroes of the story. They were the monsters, who unfortunately had so much of a power advantage that they were able to kill them, dominate their army, their culture, their entire continent of Westeros, and become their new rulers. This alternative picture of Aegon's conquest is hinted in the juxtaposition between Tyrion's romanticized idea of dragons as symbols of his personal liberation and the inescapable, brutal reality of flesh and blood human beings having feebly burned to death in dragon flame by the thousands. If that picture of Aegon's conquest happens to be a more truthful characterization of history than the perhaps romanticized version that the characters and readers are led to believe, then Tyrion's role in the story as the misunderstood good guy is hinted here to be incomplete, with the nature of his ending hinged upon whether or not he'll dispel the illusions that blind him to that terrible alternative picture. And Tyrion's ancestor, and therefore his very existence, almost being snuffed out by dragons, is a detail of Tyrion's heritage that places his obsession with dragons in an ironic and self-destructive light. It suggests that he's currently on a path that will ultimately end with him stuck at a crossroads, with subjugation on one hand and death on the other. Which is approximately where he ends up in A Dance with Dragons. He's a slave, and in order to escape his slavery, he has to risk death. But I don't think that's the archetypal extreme of that conflict. And so I don't think that's his last conflict of that kind. I think Tyrion's fate is to end up a slave to his own nihilism, where the history of his compulsion to use the truth to propel people towards nihilism like him is going to ultimately land him in a situation where the only way for him to survive is to double down on his nihilism in a way that he's not prepared to do. Just like the contradiction that's happening between Tyrion wants to burn his family alive and Tyrion wants the love of his family. And if I had to guess, I don't think Tyrion would rather die than knowingly become the villain of his own story. I don't know if Tyrion necessarily needs to literally die in order to conclude his arc, but I think he does necessarily need to die a spiritual death. But I think he is ultimately a villain, just a sad, cowardly kind of villain that cynics already are. That you keep around because you have faith that he'll do the right thing when it comes down to it. But when it does come down to it, he does the selfish and cowardly thing and makes you regret your faith in him. Tyrion's such a fascinating character. This will be my Lannister shirt. He's even got green eyes, like Cersei. Or Tywin. Anyway, thanks for watching. That was the Game of Thrones Tyrion 2. I'll see you next time.